Hello Comms 363 students. In this video I'm going to go through some sample method sections and talk about some of them, their strengths and weaknesses. And I've just done a video on the overall concepts and structures within the methods section. And so I'm going to be applying those concepts in this video. And you know, if you haven't viewed the previous video, you might find some of my judgments a bit puzzling. So it would be a good idea to view the overview of the method structure and content first before looking at this one. And I've brought these samples in from Comms 363 2015 fall, and in that term we had slightly different structures and slightly different instructions for the final report, so keep that in mind. We're also dealing with different websites than the ones that you are this term. This is the Mood Disorders Society of Canada that was chosen, and we didn't choose that for this term. But the methods section itself is, there's many different ways of organizing it, but it's often a challenge for students to cover the information concisely and completely at the same time. So we know that's going to be a challenge for you. We're going to be looking at whether you say enough in the methods section, whether you cover the methods that actually were used in order to give the results that you had. And we're going to be looking for clarity of presentation to an audience that is the website owners who don't know particular things and don't care about certain things, but actually have more important motives, what they want to know from the methods. Okay. And in this sample, we have already an example of passive voice, so even starting with the idea of language. Methods were used, and it's so much easier to say we used a combination of primary and secondary research to help our, you know, that kind of thing. So using the we would be fine. Talking about the researchers used, or, you know, basically that kind of thing, to avoid using passive voice throughout. This introductory paragraph, it has some good strengths in terms of covering things in terms of the two primary research methods. It could have actually bulletized these. You know, you've got individual blah blah blah, here's one, and then in addition secondary research was another. And so you know, you've got two primaries and then a secondary. You could use bullets to bring that out, and it's really good that they also talked about why that would be good. So it's a strength, it's a justification argument as well. So it does provide an overview, and that's nice. It would be helpful to have a heading at this point because we're going into a particular category of talking about the concepts. And it's interesting, but here, you know, they haven't yet talked about how they got these concepts. They're just listing them. So it would have been helpful to chronological order say that, you know, we did some reading in particular sources, and these are the ideas that we chose. These could be bullets, or these could be bolded, the key terms. Right now this bolding, I don't know why it's bold, it shouldn't be, but it would help emphasize the key terms. This should be parallel as possible, and you'll notice that a lot of these are about focusing on the MDSC website, which is very user-centered, and that's very nice in terms of the readers of the report. And they've used particular questions here on bullet 1 and 2. But then here they take a completely different approach and say navigation is important because, right? And so whatever approach you choose, or if you're going to say define navigation first before saying why it's important, but you know, whatever form you choose, try to make it parallel as you explain what these concepts mean. There's a little error there. And then if you don't have to cite, but sometimes you might, and in this case the citation is not really appropriate for the global level of discussing navigation. So if they talk about overall navigation, here they're talking about a menu, one primary menu, and they're giving a very specific piece of advice, how a website should only have one, and you know, this piece comes into the findings. It's so specific that it helps to support an argument there. It's not really doing the function of generally just quickly defining what overall navigation means. So that would be a better use of a citation than this. And then a sentence like this would be not needed if you're telling the reader that all of these concepts are kept in mind. Anyway, it's good that they are using the citation of specific pages using the ABC format. They don't have to. You don't have to, right? I mean, this is talking about particular data sources on the website itself. Really, this section is talking about the concepts. It doesn't really have to say we applied these to these particular pages. So, you know, the concepts are also applied to the survey data. They're not just applied to particular pages on the site, right? And so it's just the concepts here that are important, and the particular pages could be talked about when a person talks about selecting the content from within the website. So here it's a little distraction from the concepts themselves. Okay. They're trying to maybe combine too much in one or something like that. And also you'll notice this format is a little off. They don't need the hyphen. Anyway, little things like that. The heading here is good because it's unifying the section. Notice we didn't have a heading earlier, and it would be helpful to have headings like this within your methods section. And this is one option. You could structure it this way. And here it goes too much into group process. It's unnecessary word count here because the reader doesn't need to know that you had a certain type of plan and how you went about your divvying up of topics and different topics to ensure coverage and overlap and all that. Okay, all that could be avoided. And you know, mentioning the understanding of the usability features, that's something you already talked about in your previous section. This about the course handbook and the website, that goes with the concepts above, the general concepts. It doesn't quite fit under a heading that talks about the website's context and content. Okay. And so that's missing a little bit of information about how did they research the website context. This doesn't really say until they even go on to the next section without talking about what did they mean by website context. What did they study? Okay, even a sentence on that would have been fine to fulfill the promise of the heading. So here's the challenging part of talking about survey research, because it is pretty complex. And you know, here it is about at least introducing that that I was involved in managing it. But this is the first time I mentioned in this particular report, so that's kind of confusing. Who's Dr. Smith, right? So keep the readers in mind and try to start from the beginning. You know, the fact that I used SurveyMonkey is probably less important than the fact that, you know, a survey was conducted in a particular year and term of course, and that the instructor made this survey, right? So start from the beginning and start to think about what your reader needs to know first and some of the simple facts. This part here, describing the survey, is good. I mean, we need that in this section. It's just coming a little bit earlier than is expected because the context hasn't been set out yet. And it does provide a sample a little bit about a rating scale and certain things asked in question 23. And then it does the right thing of referring people to Appendix A for, you know, and then in a previous term it was every survey question. This term it's just selected survey questions. And then the research ethics are covered in their own paragraph, which helps unify things. This one gets confused confidentiality because we didn't promise confidentiality of the information that they gave us. And usability concepts. Here, the students have already talked about concepts. So here it's a little bit repetitive, and we're also getting into group process, which is not necessary. This is getting into analysis processes. And so here is at least some analysis processes are described. That's good. And uses passive voice again instead of saying we referred to secondary sources. That doesn't quite explain how secondary sources were used, but at least it says that you used them in analyzing the data. This part here doesn't quite fit under the heading of survey research. I think what the students are trying to do is conclude their section, and you don't really need to provide an overview in conclusion. In professional writing, usually the most important overviews are at the beginnings of sections, not stuck here in the end. It doesn't quite fit under a heading because it's not just about the survey data, it's about report as a whole and the website. And here is a good thing. They do talk about the respondents and preview the table 1 that they provide. And it is important to give some numbers out of the table, not all of them necessarily, and maybe the highlights of the table, what you want people to notice most important from the table. And then it does a bit of weaknesses and strengths in terms of the type of sampling, and you could do something of your own to talk about the weaknesses and strengths of the survey itself. So here's their data table, which only includes age and sex, and it was supposed to include another feature beyond that, so a third feature, and so it's missing one of those features. But it's placed properly, and it gives a title. It needs to capitalize P and D within the title, take off the period, and it also needs to say which survey question numbers it's from. So that's that sample, and I'd like to just give you an alternative of how other people did it, because I don't want you to think that's the only way to do it. So here is another one. This one is probably unnecessarily long as well in certain areas, and so I'm giving you tips about how to be concise and how to structure it so that you don't have unnecessary repetition. Here it starts with concepts, and it just says where we got them from, but then it gets into a lot of technical details about how to categorize research processes. Now that's mostly for your sake. You don't have to teach your audience how you categorize the different processes of research in terms of, oh, this is secondary and here's this and this is primary. You know, like these general subcategories and categories are being taught in isolation from the specifics of how they analyzed. So a lot of this is so general about anybody's research process that it doesn't get right to the point about how this particular research team did it. So it's more meta than it needs to be, and that can be a problem in terms of a bit wordy, a bit too instructional, not very customized to how they did things on this particular website with specific concepts. Conceptual research, it already mentioned it up there, so it's a little repetitive to have conceptual research. Another way to just do this is if you have your major heading, you could have just one sentence that says, you know, our methods encompassed conceptual research, you know, go through your headings, your major section 2 headings, and just say that, you know, this section covers these aspects of our method. And that's all you really need between your major heading and your first subheading. Okay. Conceptual research, it has a nice rationale to open it. That's great. And then this part here has the same flaw of having too much procedural information about your internal process as a group. that needs to be omitted because it's not necessary for the reader to know. They just need to know how you researched, not how you coordinated your group. This information about what you learned from, that was already up here. And so you can see why putting too much information into an overview entails unnecessary repetition. But it does provide some rationales. It lists some topics, but it doesn't give anything about how it's defined. So that's another challenge here. Here, the heading includes planning, but nothing here is about planning, and I don't think you need to cover planning. But collection and analysis is important. And so this is a nice overview before a subheading. This is a level 3 heading. Now what they're doing here is understanding the website, like the previous report did. And it's nice that they mention specific to MDSC, the website they're analyzing. And they give a rationale. And let's see if they give enough information. Nope, they don't really say what kind of research they did. How did they get information about the context? Did they Google it? What did they look for? Did they look for their Facebook page? I don't know. But so it's very generic, and it doesn't really say what was done. That's a problem. The content was analyzed using a combination of qualitative and quantitative. Okay, so here now we're doing a sort of teaching people qualitative and quantitative as a category thing, and I'm not sure if we needed it as a reader. So they could have just gotten straight to the main point about content was analyzed based on that and skip all this middle stuff and just talk about how all factors, not just visual, right? But it does talk about analysis. That's great. It doesn't really talk about any bit of selection or of collection. It just skips right to analysis. Here's an interesting quote about the weaknesses and strengths of doing that, and that's nice. It gives a little bit of a rationale since they did bring up the categories of both quantitative and qualitative. In survey research question, let's see what they did. They started with a web link email. So they started right away with recruitment, but that starts in a bit of in the middle. You know, it doesn't say anything about, well, was this in a course? What year? What, you know, who planned this? Who created this survey? Who was recruited? It doesn't say. And so it does start in the middle of the process, which is disorienting for someone who knows nothing about it. And this URL is given rather than just the name of the company, which is also a little confusing. All they need to know is that it was an online survey. They don't really have to know that it was on SurveyMonkey. And this is good in terms of giving some demographics and usability. But then they give only an example of the stem of a question. They don't give any, you know, just right away, oh, see it in Appendix B, which, you know, it should be Appendix A. So the reference to the appendix interrupts the description. You should finish your description first and then refer people to the appendix for more. We have the question stem, and then we have scales and a comment box, and then we have a rationale about why that's helpful. So it does include some important things, but it doesn't give enough of a sense of how the usability questions were structured. Yep, there was a rating scale. Yep, there was a comment box, but there were comment boxes all over the place, and not just at the ends of questions. You know, so it doesn't quite explain the structure, and you could be more concise and accurate about explaining it. And it's the option to put in a screenshot of a question from the PDF file, which is more close to what participants saw when they went to the survey on SurveyMonkey, if you look at the PDF file. Then we have a survey Excel spreadsheet. Like, this is really behind the scenes. You don't need to tell people that the data was in a spreadsheet, but you could tell them that, of course, because you weren't involved in the collection of 2015 data, that the data was provided to you this year and that you had to learn all of this stuff about its context in the past. Then ethics paragraph, that's nice. They also get anonymity and confidentiality confused, as I mentioned earlier. This is confusing because coercion has no context. It's supposed to be in the context of their option to recruit to other people rather than taking the survey themselves. So that's out of context and it doesn't make sense to a reader. And then you have topics that are itemized and then listed particular questions. I don't know if it's really informative to just number them all here. You don't have to do that because of course the reader won't know and won't care what numbers they were, and you'll have your selected questions in the Appendix A anyway. It is awkward again to talk about the participants here again when the participants were mentioned earlier, so that's a little bit out of place. So, you know, this part about the features that they focus on, the concepts, they weren't really explained in this section. Then we have a table that is so spaced out that it takes up a very long space before the findings. And this would definitely qualify for an appendix if you did this. And it also has some unnecessary features in terms of rules, and some of the striping could be problematic. So as I've mentioned in my different video on tables. So you can see that that creates unnecessary space at the bottom of this page because they want to fit all of this table into a single page. And that's why it's awkward to include in the document, and it would qualify for an appendix. So there's two samples for you, and I think that you understand that we know how challenging it is to structure this, but if you follow the guidelines in my overview video that talks about here's the general structure that makes sense for your method section and things you need to cover, we just know you're going to try your best to avoid unnecessary repetition, to delete the unnecessary information about group process and internal course procedures, but that you're going to include enough for an external reader to understand what you did, what the survey was, how it collected information, why it's important, and some of the strengths and weaknesses of both types of data that you used. So please do look at that other video, and I hope this has been helpful for you to see some actual samples. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.